According to the PE handbook, effective principals create a culture of collaboration among the school, families, and communities by creating an inviting environment that helps parents and community members feel welcome and comfortable in the school, and by ensuring that parent and community member contributions are acknowledged and valued. And I've posted a link on this particular slide for the South Dakota Parent Network. They offer, the South Dakota PIRC offers one of the most effective tools for assessing the degree to which a school is successful in achieving a culture of collaboration and an inviting environment for families and community members. And if you, at your own leisure, you can click on that link and get information about how you might conduct a family-friendly walkthrough. The Parent Network will actually bring, the South Dakota Parent Information and Resource Center will actually bring a team in, and they will administer surveys to your families, to your students, to your staff. They'll conduct a family-friendly walkthrough and give you some excellent feedback on how inviting your school is and how welcome and open you are, and other needs. This is just a good resource. There are other tools that they have available if you would explore this website. And if we can move to the next slide. The first component in Domain 5 is the culture of family, community, collaboration, and involvement. And our principal effectiveness model defines it as an effective principal supports and promotes a culture of family and community involvement to engage stakeholders in school goals and programs. And according to Epstein, Sanders, and Sheldon, effective principals recognize that involving family and the community in the education of their students has an impact on student achievement, retention rates, staff morale, and improved use of resources. Effective principals in this domain ensure that all families are welcome and that barriers to involvement have been addressed. They create partnerships to engage stakeholders in supporting school goals, and they use multiple communication strategies. As you reflect upon the progression of the rubric in this particular slide, you can see how a principal's practice at the basic level moves from working with and helping families to become involved to actually creating multiple opportunities for meaningful involvement at the proficient level. At the highest level of practice, the distinguished level, the principal monitors the success of the involvement and adjusts accordingly. Some questions for consideration. How do you make families and caregivers feel welcome in your school? How do you appropriately involve families in setting goals and making decisions about the school? And if you gather input, how do they know their input has been heard and valued? I so frequently hear that complaint from not just families, but staff members, and maybe even at that administrative level that you're at. You've asked us for our input, we've given it to you. Either you haven't used it at all, or we have no evidence of how our input's been used. So why do we even bother to provide input? I think that's a complaint you would hear at all levels when we seek input. How do you assess the effectiveness of family-community partnerships? And how do you help stakeholders connect the value of education to post-secondary success and community vitality? An interesting question and something to think about. How do families see how the value of their education directly contributes to a community's vitality? The principal effectiveness model defines the next component, two-way communication with internal and external audiences as follows. An effective principal uses multiple methods to frequently and clearly communicate to and seek input from parents, staff, and community members. And I put these 3 cartoons up because I think each of the cartoons speaks to some of the challenges we face related to effective communication. So the Peanuts cartoon, for example, really addresses how well do we really listen to our stakeholders.
And if you need it bigger, if you're looking at this through the Skype, up in the upper right corner there's 2 diagonal arrows pointing across from each other. If you click on that, it'll make it full screen.
The second cartoon addresses that idea of using multiple methods of communication and knowing which method is appropriate for the message. And finally, the challenge of achieving relevance with our stakeholders. Is the information we send the information that our stakeholders are really interested in? I know I can personally address this communication challenge. As I put these webinars together, I'm painfully aware that this is really a one-way communication process, and it isn't always the most ideal, way to get feedback and interact with the audience. And so, that's been a struggle, and I've thought a lot about that from my perspective, how to make this more effective and making sure that the information that we do give you is relevant to your needs. But it's difficult to do in a one-way communication mode, and so that's something to think about if you're in a district and you rely heavily on emails and websites and Twitter and all those electronic means of communication that we all know we need to engage in. How are we allowing for that two-way loop to occur? And I think that's a problem sometimes. As described in the recommended model for this particular component, effective principals establish, maintain, and utilize multiple communication systems for students, parents, staff, and community members, so all stakeholders have access to information about the school. Effective principals also use a variety of communication methods tailored to the intended audience and monitor to ensure that the methods are effective. Effective principals also ensure that communication is frequent, clear, and easily understood. Effective principals acknowledge incoming information and utilize the information as appropriate for decision making. And if you look at the rubrics, you can see how a principal's practice at the basic level moves from one-way communication to a more two-way type of communication at the proficient level. And at the distinguished level, the principal not only assesses the effectiveness of the communication, but shares with stakeholders how input was used in decision making. And I think that is what really distinguishes that distinguished principal, is stakeholders knowing how their input was used, to what degree was their feedback used, and how was it valued. Some questions for consideration. What are the ways in which you communicate with your stakeholders? Have you taken into consideration the demographics of your school when communicating with stakeholders? And we've already discussed this. How have you used stakeholders' input, and do you communicate to your stakeholders how you've used it? I've added a question for consideration here, and this is regarding your students. Have you considered the role of your students as stakeholders? The Danielson model frequently addresses students becoming leaders of their own learning. How do you involve students in decision-making and leadership in the school at large? This next component, a culture of dignity, fairness, and respect, one of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou, and I really think it sums this component up. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that is really does a good job of summing up this component that we want to talk about next. And again, if you look at the model, effective principles model respectful behavior and hold all the stakeholders to a high standard by taking appropriate action to reinforce respectful behavior. Effective principles take swift action when inappropriate conduct is reported or observed. And effective principles build school and community capacity for dignity, fairness, and respect by initiating direct conversations about culture and diversity and how they impact learning. And I've put a really, and as you look at the progression of the rubric, you can see that a principles practice at the proficient level moves from modeling professional, ethical, and respectful behavior at all times to developing structures, outreach, and training to build the capacity of staff, students, and stakeholders at the distinguished level. And now I want to pose this question. And I think it's a tough question, but I think it's a fair question. Should an individual who only occasionally models professionalism, and if you look at that basic level of the rubric, the term we use there is occasionally, should an individual who only occasionally models professionalism ever be in a leadership position in our school? And just a couple of questions related to this component. How do you develop the capacity of your staff and students to treat all people equitably and with respect? And how have you and your staff engaged in courageous conversations about diversity and culture and how they impact student learning? The fourth component in Domain 5 is active involvement with the community. And again, according to our principal effectiveness model, this principle exhibits high visibility and active involvement within the school and community. And as you reflect upon the graphic above, you can see the continuum of principal behaviors from that very basic level to the distinguished. These principles manage and maintain positive relationships with all individuals. They're active and visible within the district and the community. They're engaged and active participants in district meetings. They participate in district-wide projects when asked. They support the mission and vision and strategic plan of their district, and they respond in an open and timely manner when it comes to communication with colleagues. And effective principles establish connections with the community that align and support accomplishment of the school vision and goals. Effective principles are recognized by community members as effective leaders. And some questions. Do you have a strategic plan for developing partnerships within your community and with businesses? And if you do have a plan, how do you evaluate the success of the plan? How do you develop and nurture collegial working relationships within the school community? And an interesting question, number 3, how do you perceive yourself as an effective leader within the both the internal and the external school community? And how would you assess or evaluate your role as an effective leader within both the internal and external school community? Sometimes how we think we are perceived out there and how we really are perceived is a long way apart. Sometimes there's quite a distance between our perception and the reality or other people's perceptions of where we are. Okay. Domain 6, which is ethical and cultural leadership. According to Davis and Donald, cultural proficiency is a system requiring the integration and transformation of knowledge about individuals and groups of people into specific standards, policies, practices, values, and attitudes used in appropriate cultural settings to increase the effectiveness and quality of services, producing better outcomes. Effective leaders try to incorporate cultural leadership into all aspects of their work and interactions with stakeholders. And effective principals model ethical behavior, and they follow the South Dakota Code of Ethics for Professional Administrators. I have a quote on this slide. Food for thought. Transformational leaders don't start by denying the world around them. Instead, they describe a future they'd like to create instead. Something to think about related to ethical and cultural leadership. 6.1, the first component within Domain 6 is a sensitivity to diversity and cultural differences. And an effective principal expresses appreciation for and sensitivity to diversity and cultural differences.
I'm just telling you, it'd be easy.
And as you look at the graphic above, the rubric, in this standard, at the very basic level, the principal demonstrates an understanding and appreciation of the diversity of the school culture. At the proficient level, the principal not only understands and demonstrates an appreciation for a diverse culture, but also provides professional development to foster culturally responsive instruction. At the distinguished level, we see an expectation for students to accept and respect diversity. And as always, at the distinguished level, I think you hear this as a theme throughout all the domains, the principal seeks feedback from the community to assess and monitor effectiveness. Some questions. Have you assessed the needs of the school community related to culture and diversity? What staff development have you developed or facilitated to meet those needs? And number 3 is something I think we frequently see with regard to diversity and culture, is the implementation of culturally responsive instruction sporadic, a unit here and there, or is there a systemic implementation of culturally responsive instruction? That's a tough question and one to think about. How does the culturally responsive instruction fit into the expectations of a guaranteed and viable curriculum? Should there be an expectation that systemic, culturally responsive instruction should be part of the guaranteed and viable curriculum, and how do you monitor that? What student and staff behaviors are evident in your school that demonstrate an understanding of and respect for diversity among peers, and how do you seek and utilize community resources to strengthen an understanding of and respect for cultural diversity? And this last component, the last two, 6.2 and 6.3 within Domain 6, the modeling of values, beliefs, and attitudes in the South Dakota Code of Ethics. I put a quote up by Ken Blanchard that I really think speaks to this one. The first principle of ethical power is purpose. By purpose, I do not mean your objective or intention, something toward which you are always striving. Purpose is something bigger. It is the picture you have of yourself, the kind of person you want to be, or the kind of life you want to lead. I think this quote really takes these last two components down to that question of who are you? Who are you really with regard to your values, your beliefs, and your attitudes? And if you really know that, that will come through, I think, in all that you do as a leader in your school. According to the handbook, Effective principals display values, beliefs, and attitudes that inspire others to higher levels of performance and complies with the South Dakota Code of Professional Ethics. I used to say when I was working in the Rapid City School District and I worked with principals there, and I said this and believed this when I was a principal, I really believe when we serve as a principal in a school and in a community, we are a principal 24 hours a day. We don't walk away from the building at the end of the day and leave our job, and all of the values and the beliefs and attitudes that we have about being a principal, we don't leave those behind when we lock the door to the building, because people are watching us all the time when we're out in the community. And this always speaks to me when I come to this particular component. And then the rubric speaks for itself. I'm not going to go through any parts of this particular rubric because it speaks for itself. It certainly doesn't need any explanation from me. And then if we could go to the next slide. This is the level of comparison from the South Dakota Code of Ethics. And again, as I heard a principal say during one of our trainings this last summer, you either follow the South Dakota Code of Ethics or you don't. And I think that's another summary of that particular component. The next slide, as we've done with the past trainings, the past webinars, the next two slides are a list of sample artifacts, certainly not the only artifacts, just a few of probably what are many artifacts that you could use to satisfy these two domains. And let's move to the crosswalk slide. And again, I've put in a crosswalk so that you could see how domains 5 and 6 on the principal effectiveness model are connected to domains 1, 2, and 4 of the teacher effectiveness model, so that you can see how those go together. Now, in the PowerPoint that I mailed out yesterday evening, you have an extra slide in your PowerPoint, and I apologize for that. It's titled Domain 3. The PowerPoint I've been using today has that slide deleted. You have the ability to edit the PowerPoints that I've sent you via email, and you can work with them in any way you want. So you can leave that slide in or you can delete it. That was an error on my part, and I apologize for that. And if we could move to the next slide. As always, I like to put in a link so that you can go to the turnaround principles and you can see how the principal effectiveness model lines up with the turnaround principles if you're a school working with those. And then finally, that same slide that you've seen many times, the link to the Teacher Principal Effectiveness website at the South Dakota Department of Ed. We're well within our time limit. We're at 24 minutes here. So we've kept it in that 30-minute range. So I would offer, are there any questions that you might have at this point? Would welcome questions. You can either type them in for Matt, or we could unmute so that you could ask the question.
You let them know they're all unmuted now.
You're all unmuted, so we would welcome any questions or feedback. If not, we would wish you a good afternoon and a good evening, and we will visit with you in March.